Come on, isn't that good news? Um, so grateful for CMN and so grateful we can partner with them, and your generosity makes that possible. Well, we are continuing our series through the Gospel of Mark. Today we are in chapter 8, and we're discovering what it means to follow Jesus. Several years ago, MSNBC ran a news report about a new group of vegetarians. Now, I'm not a vegetarian, nothing against anyone that is, I just like meat, okay? But in this particular interview, one individual made a statement that captured the essence of what these new vegetarians were all about. She said, "I usually eat vegetarian, but I really like sausage." She represents a growing number of people who eat vegetarian, but make some exceptions. Now, true vegetarians apparently put pressure on the new vegetarians that they can't call themselves vegetarians and therefore needed to change their name. So the new vegetarians chose the name Flexitarians. One individual in the interview said this: "I really like vegetarian food, but I'm just not 100% committed." Flexitarian is a good way to describe not just someone that might prefer meat on occasion whenever it comes to the food that they eat. It also describes how some people respond and view and take their approach to following Jesus. It sounds kind of like this: I follow Jesus, but I don't really like what he said about serving others. I follow Jesus, but I don't agree with what he taught about forgiving my enemies. I follow Jesus, but I think his teaching on sexuality is antiquated. I follow Jesus, but I don't like what he said about money. In other words, we want to follow Jesus on our terms. But as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Mark, we discover that Jesus provides some very clear instruction in this particular chapter of what it means to be his follower, of what it means to follow Jesus fully and completely. And so from his teaching in Mark 8, I want to take a few moments today to unpack what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. And what I'm going to share with you comes straight from Jesus' mouth. This is what he said it meant to be his follower. And there's three things that stand out in this passage. The first key to following Jesus is confession. Confession. In Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 27, this is how the verse begins. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. Now, what was Caesarea Philippi like? Well, Caesarea Philippi had a history of idol worship. For example, it was once the center of worship to Baal. It was also considered to be the birthplace of Pan, the god of nature. And when Philip the Tetrarch inherited the territory from his father, Herod the Great, Philip renamed it Caesarea in honor of Caesar Augustus. It was here that Philip built a great temple made of white marble to the godhead of Caesar, the Roman emperor. Caesar was the ruler of the world, and therefore he was considered deity. He was regarded as a god. Why is this significant? Here's why this is significant. Because Jesus continues by asking a question of his disciples. So get the picture. He's in this place that acknowledges Caesar as a god, and in that place, Jesus poses a question. We read it in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" Now, if someone came up to you and asked that question, who do people say I am? You would think to yourself either A, this person is really arrogant, or B, they are really insecure, or C, both, right? That's just not something you say. But remember where Jesus is when he asked this question. Caesarea Philippi is not only a place filled with idols, it's also a place where people hail Caesar as a god. So Jesus says, who do people say I am? How do his disciples respond? Verse 28, look what he says. Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets. Now, why would people refer to Jesus in these three ways? Well, some called him John the Baptist, particularly Herod Antipas, who had John the Baptist put to death because he didn't like what John said about him and his wife. And so he thinks when he sees Jesus, this is John the Baptist risen from the dead. Elijah. Some assumed Jesus was Elijah because God promised to send Elijah back before the coming of the Lord. And so some thought this is that time. This is Elijah. And then some thought he was a prophet. Some thought he was a prophet like Jeremiah, whom Jewish tradition believed would return with the Ark of the Covenant when the Messiah's kingdom was established. So everyone had an opinion of who Jesus was, but by and large, they did not consider Jesus who he actually was, the Messiah. Why? Because in the Jewish mindset, they expected the Messiah to be a military ruler. They expected the Messiah to be a military deliverer who would overthrow Rome and establish an autonomous kingdom in Israel. And Jesus didn't fit that bill. So after they respond to Jesus' question, Jesus then turns the question to them. And this is what he says, verse 29. Then he asks them, but who do you say I am? Peter replied, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. The term Messiah means anointed one. In the Old Testament, it was a royal title used to refer to divinely appointed kings of Israel. So when Peter makes this declaration, he's basically saying Jesus is God's supreme anointed one. In his classic book, Science Speaks, Peter Stoner explored the likability that Jesus was actually the Messiah prophesied about in the Old Testament. And so he explored the likability of him fulfilling just 8 of those messianic prophecies. And based on his research, which was affirmed by the American Scientific Affiliation, he discovered that the probability of one person being able to fulfill just 8 of the messianic prophecies would be 1 in 100 quadrillion. That's 1 with 17 zeros behind it. Peter Stoner then made a comparison. He said, imagine stacking silver dollars across the entire state of Texas, okay? We know this is a big state. Imagine stacking silver dollars across the entire face of our state all the way up to your knees. And he said, and then imagine taking one of those coins and putting a mark on it, and it's somewhere amidst all of those coins across the state. He said, then take someone, blindfold them, and tell them they have one chance to find the coin with the marking on it. He said, those are the odds of one person fulfilling just 8 of the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. And yet, on the conservative side, theologians believe that Jesus fulfilled at least 108 prophecies, and some believe over 300 prophecies. So the chances of fulfilling 16 prophecies is 1 in 10, followed by 45 zeros. The chance of fulfilling 48 prophecies is 1 in 10, followed by 157 zeros. Jesus is clearly the Messiah. The question is, who do you say he is? who do you say he is? Because just like then, the same is true now, that following Jesus begins by confessing who he is. Not who you think he is, not who you hoped he might be, not who you want him to be so that it fits into your own worldview, but confessing deliberately, no, this is who Jesus is. The word confess means to agree with the truth, not to change the truth, to agree with the truth. Like if you confess something about yourself, you're agreeing with the truth that you're revealing to somebody, right? To confess means to agree with the truth. So when we confess Christ, we are agreeing with the truth that he is the Messiah, that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. The Apostle Paul said it like this in Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. He said, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. Notice, if you do this, what will be the outcome? The outcome will be you will be saved. Saved from what? Saved from your own sinfulness. Saved from your sin that separates you from God. Saved by the fact that Jesus hung on a cross to pay the penalty that you and I deserved for our sin, and yet he bore it on the cross that we could be made right with God. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Who do you say Jesus is? Your confession, my friend, leads to your salvation. So, number one, following Jesus starts with confession. Number two, it requires alignment. Alignment. Once a confession of faith in Christ is made, everything about our lives must come into alignment with that confession. Why? Because you cannot claim Jesus is Lord in your life without letting him be Lord in your life. You understand that, right? You can't say, oh yes, Jesus is Lord, except in this area and this area and this area. These areas, Jesus are off limits. No, to claim Jesus as Lord is to say, Jesus, not only do I declare you as Lord, but you have freedom in all areas of my life. All areas of my life I will choose. As you show this to me, as you reveal, as your Spirit works in my heart, I will align every area of my life to your will, to you. Now, Peter, who had made this great declaration of who Jesus was, that he is the Messiah, Peter makes his declaration, and it's kind of like, way to go, Peter, man, great job, right answer. The same guy who makes this declaration is about to learn firsthand he's missed the gap, like he's missed the point of this. Look what happens in verse 31. Verse 31, then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. Everything Jesus is saying is a prediction of what's about to happen, of what is to come. Jesus would be rejected by the religious leaders. In other words, he would be rejected as their own Messiah. Jesus went through a mock trial where he was delivered to the Romans to be executed, crucified on a cross. And 3 days after his death, Jesus indeed rose from the dead. Now, here's the thing. Jesus had spoken about this in other instances, but it was a little more veiled whenever he would share about it. But here, he's very blatant. He's very straightforward about what is to come, about what will happen to him. And when he is this straightforward, his disciples are stunned when they hear this. Notice how they respond, verse 32. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. That word reprimand, that word reprimand implied a level of authoritative judgment from a superior to someone under their command. So get the picture. Peter, the same guy who had just declared that Jesus is the Messiah, the one with supreme authority over all creation, that same guy is now putting Jesus under his authority. So how does Jesus respond? Two can play this game. He reprimands Peter. Peter, you got this wrong, buddy. I'm not under your authority. And look what he says, verse 33. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. That's a fail, right? I mean, if Jesus calls you Satan, that's a fail, right? Now you may say, what did Jesus mean? Jesus wasn't literally saying that Peter is Satan. Instead, what he was saying is that, Peter, you're being a spokesman for Satan. You're being a spokesman for what is not of God, for what is not God's will. He's saying, you're about to thwart the purposes of God, Peter. You're about to thwart the purposes of God. What must happen, you're trying to get in the way of it happening. And then Jesus makes it painstakingly clear in the remainder of verse 33. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." That's convicting. Let's bring this down to where we live, right? Let's make this really personal. How many times do we get in the way of the will of God because we don't like the ways of God? Right? God's got his will. His intention is that that will be carried out. But because we don't like the way in which that will is being carried out, we get vocal. We make it known. We think that we know better than God, and so we want God's will to adjust to our wants, to our desires, to our ways. But in those moments, we're doing exactly what Peter did. We're seeing things merely from a human point of view. We're not seeing things from the perspective of God. And can I just tell you, that's a dangerous place to be. That's a dangerous place to live. Because in those moments, what you're doing is you are trying to make Jesus look like you instead of you look like him. And that brings us to this last discovery in Mark 7 of what it means to follow Jesus. It begins with a confession, then it requires us to align our will with his will. And finally, number 3, it only gets harder as we go here. Finally, it just requires commitment, full-on commitment. After Jesus rebukes Peter, he widens his audience to address this on a greater level, because what he's about to say next gets to the crux of what it means to follow Jesus. Verse 34 through 38. Then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, he's about to lay down, this is what it means to be my follower. "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Following Jesus just got a little harder. Doesn't sound like name it, claim it, does it? Doesn't sound like I'm going to get my blessing. No, when we talk about the blessing of God and the goodness of God and the favor of God, which are all very real things, so please hear me. I'm not saying these are not, this is not part of God's power and ability and purpose in our lives, okay? I'm not saying that at all. But hear me, friend. Following Jesus is not all about what you can gain for your benefit. It is full yield, full surrender to Him and His will and His ways. And what I've discovered is that the more you let go, the more He can trust you with. The more you're willing to surrender, the more He says, you're a faithful steward. And I can bless that. But that's not why we do it. That's not the why. It is saying, Jesus, I fully, completely surrender to you and your perfect will. Come what may. Come what may. I want us to pay special attention to verse 34 because Jesus emphasizes a couple of things in verse 34. First, he says, like, if you want to be my follower, he says, you must give up your own way. Many translations say that you must deny yourself. The Greek word used to describe this means to have no association with. It means to disown completely. Simply put, Jesus is saying that to follow Him means to give everything for His sake. It means full surrender. And yet, how many of you know that in our culture that doesn't go down real well? Because we live in a culture of consumerism. We don't want to surrender anything. We want to consume everything. And yet Jesus makes it clear. You got to give up your own way. Which kind of makes sense because think about it. How can Jesus be Lord in our life if we insist on having our own way? Who's really Lord in that situation? Who's really the one that's leading? Who's the one that's in control? The 18th century French philosopher Voltaire, he said it like this: if God made us in His image, we have returned Him the favor. In other words, God made us in His image, and ever since we've been making Him in our image. We've been trying to make God into what we want Him to look like and what we believe Him to be. We've been trying to make God into something He is not. We must give up our own way. What's the second thing Jesus says in this passage? He says, take up your cross. Now, the cross obviously has extraordinary meaning in the Christian faith, but what did it mean back in Jesus' day? Today, we wear it around our neck. It's a symbol of our faith, and it's a reminder of Jesus and the sacrifice He made, okay? But they weren't wearing crosses around their neck back then, okay? That would be like you and I wearing a necklace around our neck with an electric chair tied to it. We don't do that. That's what it would have been like back in Jesus' day. Why? Because the cross meant execution. The cross meant, it was something that the Romans used to force people into submission. It was a symbol of the Romans' power and strength. You see, every once in a while, a group of Jewish rebels would rise up against Roman oppression, and the Romans would crucify those involved in the rebellion. And there are even accounts where they crucified as many as 2,000 people at one time. So what did the cross mean? The cross was a symbol of humiliation, a symbol of suffering, and a symbol of death. Welcome to church. So when Jesus calls us to take up our cross, what is He doing? He's calling us to humble ourselves. He's calling us to be willing to suffer for His name's sake. And He's calling us to die to our selfish desires. What does that look like? Well, here's how the Bible describes it. Luke 6, blessed are you when people hate you when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. 2 Timothy 3. Yes, and everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Philippians 1, for you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for him. Let me ask you a hard question for us today. When was the last time following Jesus cost you something? You talking about money, Stephen? I'm talking about anything. When was the last time following Jesus cost you something? It required sacrifice. It came with persecution. It came with somebody coming against you. Like, when was the last time there was something you had to give up for the sake of following Jesus? There is a cost to following Jesus. And it begins with confession, and then it says, okay, now you've confessed me as Lord. Let's align your life with my will. And then, by the way, guys, it's full-on commitment. It's full-on commitment. And yet, here's the remarkable thing. With full-on commitment comes immense joy, which does not make sense. How can there be joy and suffering at the same time? How can there be joy and death to self at the same time? How do those things even go together? That's the mystery of the kingdom, friend. There is joy in surrender. There's a cost to following Jesus. Adoniram and Ann Judson discovered this firsthand and were prepared to pay the cost. At the age of 24, Adoniram felt God leading him to leave the United States and to go to Burma in Southeast Asia to share the gospel. Burma didn't have a single missionary at the time, and it was a very hostile environment. And at that time, with his decision to go, he was simultaneously in love with Anne, the girl that he had been seeing and wanted to marry. And so he wanted to propose to Anne, and he wanted to ask her to be his wife. But before he did, he wrote a letter to her father. And he wrote a letter that, if you're a dad, this would be a really hard letter to receive. I couldn't imagine writing this letter to my father-in-law, much less receiving this letter from my son-in-law. This is what Adoniram wrote. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness? Can you imagine writing that to your soon-to-be father-in-law? Can you imagine receiving that letter? As a dad, this is the letter that he writes. Whenever he writes this letter, I'm sure a world of emotions went through her father's mind, but in the end, he basically said, this is her decision. This is her decision. Anne then later wrote a letter to her close friend Lydia, and this is what she said in her letter. I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and go where God in his providence shall see fit to place me. In 1813, Adoniram and Anne left for Burma. And when they arrived, they experienced one hardship after another, after another, after another. 11 years later, in 1824, Adoniram was put in prison for 18 months. And in prison, every day, he would be hoisted up by his feet up into the air until the only thing that touched the ground was his head and his shoulders, and he would be kept in that position and tortured. It was often 110 degrees at night, and he would be eaten alive by mosquitoes. At the time, whenever he went into prison, Anne was pregnant with their daughter. And yet, being pregnant with their daughter every day, she walked 2 miles to plead for Adoniram's release from prison. Unsuccessfully, but every day, that's what she would do. After a year in prison, Adoniram had wasted away. He literally only could eat rotten food, and he was crippled from the torture that he was receiving. And it was during that time that his daughter Maria was born. Whenever she was born, the jailer actually gave permission for Adoniram to leave at night to take his wife to try to find somebody to nurse the baby, because his wife was in such bad health herself that she had no milk to offer the child. And so they would go out at night and try to find somebody to nurse the baby. And when Adoniram was finally released from prison, it was only a short time later that his wife, Anne, died at the age of 37. When you hear a story like that, you go, really? Really, God? That's the way it works? Was it even worth it? Was it worth the commitment to say, Jesus, I'm all in, you name the place, and my answer is yes? Was it really worth it? Well, because of Adoniram and Anne's efforts, the entire Bible was translated into Burmese. And today, there are 3,700 congregations in Burma that can trace their roots all the way back to Adoniram and Ann Judson. So you tell me, was it worth it? Was the temporary worth it for the eternal gain? Friends, I know this is a hard message. But if we're kidding ourselves that following Jesus is always a cakewalk, and that when you say yes to Jesus, you're saying yes to all of these wonderful things, and he's going to bless you, and you're never going to have a problem again, and life is going to be good, and I'm sorry, friend, that's just not true. And if anyone's telling you that, I'm sorry, but they're not being truthful with you about the gospel and what it means to follow Jesus. He can bless you, and he will. He is good. And Karen and I can point to many times over our lives where God has blessed in ways that we don't feel like we deserved, that he was good and he was faithful and he provided and he did things, and we're just humbled by that. But friend, at the same time, it's about following the one who is Lord, which means he gets to lead, not us. He gets to say where we're going to go and what we're going to do and what he would have. And our job as followers of Jesus, for all of us, our job is to say yes and then to trust him with the outcome. Following Jesus is a commitment. It is not something you add to your life the same way you would add anything else to your life. It's not something you add to your schedule the same way you would add baseball practice to your schedule, or the same way you would add meetings to your schedule, or the same way you would add a new hobby to your schedule. No, following Jesus is saying, Jesus, you get to be the center, and you can influence everything else in my life. It's something you give your life for, and yet, and I'll say it again, and yet in surrender, you discover joy. You discover joy, unexplainable joy, joy that doesn't make sense in the midst of hardship, joy that doesn't make sense when everything in our human nature says, hold on and control, and yet Jesus says, open your hand and surrender. It's in surrender that you find joy. You find joy. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? It means confessing Christ as Lord. It means aligning our will to his will. It means commitment to Jesus even when the cost is high. And in all of it, experiencing the joy of knowing and serving Christ. Let's pray.